Good afternoon and welcome to today's briefing on desktops and ANSI square footage calculation. My name is Bill Garber and I'm the Director of Government and External Relations for the Appraisal Institute. Today's webinar will provide an inside look at upcoming changes recently announced by Fannie Mae in relation to desktop appraisals and the ANSI square footage measurement standard. We'll introduce our speakers in just a moment, but before we begin, there are several housekeeping items that we'd like to attend to. First of all, audio options. You can listen to today's briefing through your computer by turning up your computer speakers. If you have any trouble with the computer audio at any time, you can listen through the phone by dialing the number on the screen, which was also emailed to you in our calendar reminders from the Appraisal Institute. Today's webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, and since we have a limited amount of time, all questions will be addressed after the presenters have given their discussions. You can, however, submit a question at any time during the presentation. Just click on the Q&A tab, Questions tab, in your dialogue, your participant dialogue box, and then type the question and click Ask. When you ask a question, please indicate which presenter your question is for. And if you have any technical issues with the software, there is a technical support number there. And again, this number is also in the email that you were sent for confirmation for today's briefing. And we have one other disclaimer. The views expressed in today's webinar do not necessarily reflect the official position of the agencies or organizations participating today. Now I would like to hand the baton to the 2022 President of the Appraisal Institute, Jody Bishop. Good afternoon, Jody.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon to all our participants. This is an awesome forum that we have put together today to just do some exploration as to the ANSI square footage calculation and its appropriateness, or what the market participants think the appropriateness may or may not be in our market, as well as we're going to explore the desktop appraisals, and as they're starting to enter into the profession. So with that said, I'd like to welcome today's speakers and panelists. Lyle Radke is the Senior Director of Collateral Policy at Fannie Mae, which establishes and maintains policy standards for appraisals and property eligibility. Lyle's team develops and promotes policy standards through its selling guide and Uniform Appraisal Data Set, which is collectively known as UAD, through technology systems such as Collateral Underwriter and Condo Project Manager, and through communications such as our quarterly appraiser newsletter, job aids, training videos, user guides, and FAQs. And our panelists are Alan Gardner, who's an owner of Gardner Ray LLC. It's a leading appraisal and real estate consulting firm in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Lubbock area of Texas. Gardner Ray LLC offers residential and commercial appraisal services and was founded in 2016. Prior to venturing on his own appraisal service company, Alan was the vice president of residential for one of the larger appraisal and consulting firms in North Texas area, and he began his career in 1992. Alan currently holds the MAI and SRA designations with the Appraisal Institute. Welcome, Alan. Dawn M. Molitor-Ginrich is president of the Molitor-Ginrich Consulting. Dawn holds the SRA and AIRRS designations from the Appraisal Institute. She is a certified appraiser in the state of California, a past member of the Appraisal Standards Board, a certified USPAP instructor, and holds an IDAC distance education instructor certification. Dawn provides consulting services in real property appraisal and real estate regulatory compliance for financial institutions and their agents or servicers, appraisal software developers, real property appraisal firms, litigation, attorneys, and regulatory agencies. Welcome, Dawn. Mark Barrett, SRA, is the Chief Innovations Officer at Accurity Consolidated in Houston, Texas. Mark is a second-generation practicing appraiser and leading voice in innovation within the appraisal industry. Previously, Mark served as a director in the National Real Estate Database Company, leading the development of innovative software and applications in real estate. Mark holds the SRA designation from the Appraisal Institute and serves on the Appraisal Institute's board of directors. Thank you all for being with us today. Let's begin with an overview from Lyle. Thanks again for joining us. Lyle?
Thank you.
And Lyle, bear with me here. I'm trying to hand presentation to you.
Well, Bill is working on that. A little bit more about myself. I live in Plano, Texas, and I am married with 4 children, 2 of whom are in college. My educational background was in geology, which is a science. So I tend to approach appraising from more of a scientific perspective, although geology is a little different from, let's say, physics. It's not as mathematically rigorous. It involves a little bit more of the art, so to speak, which makes it a good fit for geology.
And Lyle, you should have control now. If you don't, let me know.
I have control, and I think I'm sharing.
Yes.
Great. Well, similar to Bill's disclaimer, I also have a disclaimer. This essentially says, no matter what I say, you can't hold it against me. The selling guide rules. So I'll try and be consistent with the selling guide. But if I do mess up and say anything inconsistent with it, then you'll understand it was just my mistake. So what the Appraisal Institute invited me to do today is to give you a quick walkthrough of our these 2 new policies on the agenda. One is the adoption by Fannie Mae of the ANSI GLA standard, and the other is our recent announcement about desktop appraisals. So let's start with ANSI. Just in case you missed it, we did make this announcement on December 15th, but it doesn't go into effect until April 1st, or in other words, for appraisals with effective dates as of April 1st. We are requiring appraisals from backing the loans that lenders deliver to us to follow the ANSI standard. Now, there are some caveats, but those are sort of built into ANSI itself. So we'll talk a little bit about those as we go. We do also have an exception process. I will say that the exception process is for homes that really don't fit ANSI. It's not for the convenience of the appraiser who doesn't want to learn ANSI. So we'll make that distinction. So why bother, right? Why standardize the GLA? We thought about this for quite a while. One is that GLA is extremely important to value. Getting the GLA right, or having a consistent unit of comparison is essential to getting an accurate value. Second of all, there isn't really a universal standard, and I think my own story might be representative of what some of you have experienced. When I first came into the appraisal business, I was taught to measure homes by my supervisor, my mentor, was an FHA appraiser, and so he measured the FHA way, and of course there was the old 4150 handbook, which was very prescriptive, very lengthy, about all things home related, home inspection related, and so I learned that methodology, and at some point FHA retired that handbook, right? And I think it left kind of a void for our profession. And we've lived with that void for a long time. But the ANSI itself was developed in about 1996. I think the process began in 1994. There were probably 26. I think what we've read is that there were 26 different institutions that came together to collaborate to create this standard. And Fannie Mae was one of them, although I don't think we were necessarily the leader in the space. But the National Association of Home Builders was a leader and an advocate, and they sponsor it. Others, like the National Association of Realtors and other secondary market entities, were participants also. So it was a group effort by the primary organizations of our profession, and it was finalized, so to speak, in 1996, or launched, and it's gone through a couple of revisions since then. But I think it was heavily influenced by that earlier generation of appraisers who were HUD trained and who did do it that way. Because when I look at ANSI, I see it's very similar to how I was trained, and I would find it to be, probably pretty seamless to adopt in most cases. So, getting back to the slide here, there's a void. The void has been kind of an itch that we wanted to scratch for a long time, but there have been some developments recently that made this maybe a little more important, and so we decided to go ahead and do this. Now, we researched quite a few different options. We researched all the available standards. We thought about developing our own standard. Ultimately, we felt like ANSI was the best fit universally, and I'll talk a little bit more about that next. So what are the benefits? What's in it for you, right? Number one, it creates alignment, or at least creates the opportunity for alignment across multiple professions, multiple sources. We've already been asked about this policy by a number of different entities. We've had conversations with the National Association of Realtors. We've had conversations with the CMLS. Like I mentioned before, the National Association of Home Builders has adopted this. So we see an opportunity here to take a leadership position and really encourage others involved in real estate to follow and to adopt this standard, and to kind of get a uniform language, so to speak, when talking about something so important as the square footage of the house. This is good for consumers, right? It is sometimes for appraisers, we appraise whatever 500 homes a year, and this gets to be old hat. But for the buyer of the home, they may only get one appraisal in a lifetime, or one appraisal every, the old metric that I used to know is that people would move every 7 years. I think it's even longer than that now, but people do not get appraisals very often. And so they are not necessarily expert at reading the appraisal. Being able to point to a consistent professional standard is good for them. It helps them understand where this information is coming from and how it's been developed. It's transparent for the appraisal report reader, right? They know where it came from. It reduces bias in the sense that if you always do it the same way, then it takes discretion out of the process. And discretion is really something that appraisers need, because you're developing a professional opinion, but at the same time, it's a two-edged sword. It's dangerous because it leaves you exposed to accusations that you've used that discretion inappropriately. So how do you defend yourself against those kinds of accusations? And one way is you want to have an explanation of how you made your decisions, what drove your decisions. The professional consistent standard is a great way to defend yourself, right? And then for the people who use appraisals in the lending business, this creates something that's consistent and repeatable, allows us to understand what we're getting, and it helps us to measure our risk more accurately. So I think it's good for everybody across the spectrum. That's not to say it's not without challenges, but there's certainly benefits. So why choose ANSI of all the options? Well, first of all, it is right now the most widely used. There are a number of states that have formally adopted it for their appraisers. There are a number of different assessor organizations and even real estate boards that have adopted it. So there's some mandatory adoption in the industry already, but there's a lot of voluntary option beyond the mandatory. I can tell you, since we've made the announcement, I've been approached by many appraisers who said, this is a great idea. I've been using ANSI since 1996. I see all the benefits. It's worked great for me. That's rewarding for us to hear that, but I think it's important for you in the audience to understand that many of your peers, if you're an appraiser, have already chosen to use ANSI voluntarily, and that's because of the benefits. Also, it's pretty easy to adopt, right? It's 16 pages. Some of those pages are like disclaimers and additional information, the history, and so, you know, the actual standard itself is even shorter than that. And like I say, it's very similar to the methodologies that are already in common practice in many cases. So we felt like those together, and plus the, you know, it's relatively easy to get a class on ANSI right now. There are several organizations that offer classes, continuing ed, so you can get up to speed quickly. It's pretty easy to adopt. It's in use by a lot of different organizations already, voluntary use by many of your peers. So we just felt like that was the path that made the most sense. So we get asked a lot of questions about this, and I just thought I'd bring in a couple of questions to kind of prime the pump here. Does the ANSI standard apply to apartment, multifamily, condo, co-op, or 2 to 4 unit? And the answer is, you have to be careful here to differentiate between type of ownership rights, bundle of rights, versus type of construction or style of construction, right? And it's easy to confuse that point. What ANSI talks about is the style of construction, not the form of ownership. So for something like a condo, you can have condos that are apartment style, you can have condos that are not. ANSI itself excludes all apartment style buildings, multifamily style construction. So we will follow the standard, and that's what the standard says, is that it's not appropriate for that type of construction. How about for outbuildings, tool sheds, garage, things like that? And then the answer is no, ANSI is just for the heated living area or the finished area. There's lots of different synonyms, right? And that's part of the problem. What do I mean when I say finished area or heated living area? Well, what I mean is whatever ANSI defines it, because that's why we adopted ANSI. So we would know what we meant when we said those things. All right, one last question. How do I adjust comparables if they're not ANSI? I hear this one a lot, right? This is gonna totally mess up my value. No, not really. You already have this problem, okay? No matter what standard you use to measure the subject, there's no guarantee that the counterparty who's developing comp data, whether it's in public record or MLS or some other source, is following the same standard that you are. No guarantee. In fact, in many cases, the appraiser doesn't know where that other party's GLA came from. And if they do know, they know it's not consistent with how appraisers do it. And we already mentally make these adjustments as we consume comparable data. So we'll continue to do that. We're solving the same problem we've always had to solve. The difference is where you're coming from is going to be a consistent place. But the necessity of adjusting what others are doing or analyzing what others are doing, that's always been the case, and it'll continue to be the case. All right, what happens if ANSI is not possible? Well, a great example of this would be, let's say, a berm home or a home that's entirely below grade. It doesn't have a level that's entirely above grade. We don't necessarily think it's useful or productive to show 0 square feet, right? So 0 GLA. So in that case, you would probably want to opt out and show the principal level as being GLA. In that case, if you're going to opt out of ANSI, then we want you to enter this code here. And to tell you the truth, I don't know where this code came from. It looks kind of crazy to me. I don't know how we're going to remember it. I guess it's one of those things I'm going to put on my sticky and stick it on my desk and stare at it every day. But it's GXX001-. You put that at the beginning of the additional features field of the appraisal. And then you follow that with a little explanation of why ANSI couldn't be followed in that case. So there is that opt-out option for the really strange stuff. All right, some resources. Bill, are you going to be able to distribute the resource slide to everybody? I guess I would need to send this to you. I will send it to you.
Yeah, that's fine. You can send it.
Now, we've got a fact sheet and a video. We've got the selling guide references if you want to look there, which when I was an appraiser, I really didn't look at the Fannie Mae selling guide. I should have, right? Look where I'm at now. Oh my gosh, I could have been so much further ahead, but it's a great resource, I think, for appraisers. So looking back, if I had studied that better, it would have helped me in my appraisal work. But it is not easy reading. Okay, it's technical. Then you can get your own copy of the standard at this website here. And I've listed 3 other websites. These are articles or blogs where appraisers have talked about ANSI from their point of view. But normally I wouldn't necessarily share what other people are saying, but I thought these 3 in particular were really insightful, really powerful from the appraiser's perspective. And so I'd really encourage you to go read these if you want to know more about what ANSI means for you as a professional. With that, I'll switch to desktop appraisals. So we made our selling guide announcement around desktop appraisals on February 2nd. And this one has also got an effective date in the future. It'll be effective for, in this case, it's not for effective dates of appraisals, but it's for loan applications. So that's because the lender has to do some things on their side in order to prepare to consume a desktop appraisal. But for loan applications beginning March 19th, lenders will be able to look into our automated underwriting system, which is Desktop Underwriter. And if the loan is eligible for a desktop appraisal, they'll get a message to that effect in Desktop Appraisal. If they don't have the message, then they can't get a desktop appraisal. So what triggers the message, right? The eligible transactions are for purchases of owner-occupied properties, excluding second homes, so it's primary occupant, primary resident, and for single family 1 unit, which is effectively properties that go on the URAR. And the initial purchase price has to be, or the initial LTV, loan to value ratio, using the purchase price as a proxy for value, needs to be less than or equal to 90%. So we're excluding the high loan to value loans. Okay. So what are some of the reasons behind this? First of all, it increases flexibility and speed, right? So this is not a benefit for appraisers necessarily, although it could be. It is primarily a benefit for consumers, for home buyers. But for appraisers, there's an opportunity here for you to be able to work differently. If you like doing the analytical type work, which I do, you can do more analytical type work and do less driving around. And that could be a good business model for some people. So there's an opportunity for some to adopt a business model that's more efficient, more focused on valuation, less focused on the other aspects of the business, like driving around and inspecting properties. And this also we see as a potential impact on the bias question. And the way it works is this: if you never meet a person, you're less likely to be biased against them. So it's a pretty simple argument. It's not the primary driver of this. I think the consumer benefits are more important, but it's just a thing to think about, right? And then finally, it can help alleviate appraiser capacity issues because you do become more efficient without having to do all that driving. When I was practicing, I put regularly 30 to 40,000 miles on my car every year. And buying a new car every 4 or 5 years was not a joyous moment for me, and spending all that time driving around the car and trying to figure out how to make that time effective was also a challenge for me. So for those of you who felt like I do, that, man, I spend a lot of time driving, maybe I should be a truck driver, this can alleviate some of that and make you more efficient. So there's some instructions for you. What do you need to do? There will be on the form, you're going to use the desktop appraisal form that we announced in July of 2020. And it's a UAD compliant form. We announced it jointly with Freddie Mac, and that's the one that you will use. Now that's different than what we used under COVID. And there's several reasons for that, but the primary reason is it didn't exist yet when COVID started, and we launched it after the beginning of COVID. The good thing about this is instead of having to do this awkward like copy and paste of a bunch of certifications and then put some code in the map reference field where it doesn't really belong and try to sort all that out, this is built to accommodate desktops and to accommodate your scope of work, limiting conditions, and certifications. So it's a seamless form that way. Now there is a section on page 3 that asks you to provide new information that you don't normally do with a URAR, and that's shown here on the screen. You'll tag it as a desktop appraisal. You'll tag the property data collection as method as other, because you're not really collecting property data, you're sort of assembling it. There's a distinction. And then since there's no property data collection method, then there's no date and no workforce for that activity. The photo requirements are essentially the same as the regular URAR, no change. There is a requirement, this is made by the certifications themselves, that the report include a floor plan exhibit. A floor plan is more robust than a sketch. A floor plan includes interior walls, doorways, staircases, the exterior ingress and egress, labels for each room, and then of course the dimensions for the exterior walls, which is the same as what you already do. When I was practicing, I've generally provided most of this, but not all of it necessarily, depend on the situation, right? If I was trying to represent functional obsolescence, I would. And this is going to be very similar. The difference is that you, the appraiser, are not really accountable for generating it because you're not necessarily inspecting the home. So you'll probably obtain this from a third party. Now there's a whole bunch of different ways that you might be able to obtain a floor plan, or you might be able to even kind of assemble a floor plan from more than one source. And I think we can talk a lot more about that as time goes on, but there's technology innovation happening that can help support this process. And again, this is one of those things that we've been talking about in the realtor or real estate community about how they might be able to help facilitate desktop appraisals on their transactions. The important thing for you to think about is an appraiser needs to understand the functional utility of the home. And when you're doing a desktop appraisal, you're not able to personally identify functional elements, right? So we want to make this a robust data process for the appraiser, where the appraiser is given enough information to make appropriate valuation decisions related to functional utility. So this is not intended to be a burden for the appraiser, it's rather intended to be an assist for the appraiser, give you the information at least some of the information you miss by not going to the property. And then here's again some resources, and Bill, I'll get those to you after the call. All right, back to you guys.
Okay, that was an excellent overview, Lyle. I really appreciate it. So now we're going to move to some initial comments by our panelists. So first up will be Alan Gardner, and he'll be followed by Dawn and then Mark. So Alan, welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Jody. Appreciate it. Do you want us to comment just on ANSI first and then let everybody go through and then go back to desktop, or get it all out at once?
Might be better just to do it all at once, and then we can get into the questions. How about that?
That's great. Lyle, we appreciate you being here. I know there's a lot of questions with a lot of appraisers, and we're all trying to figure it out. Honestly, for myself and our company, we're still working through it. Honestly, we welcome an ANSI standard and the fact that it's nice to have a standard. I believe our biggest concern is how we how we address that, and with all the different involved people that are in the market. With Fannie Mae being the only one coming out saying they're supporting ANSI, our concern is that other market standards haven't necessarily followed up. I know the National Association of Realtors recently put out a letter that kind of stated this, and whether it was their concern as well. A great example, I guess, is in our market anyway, we recognize that even though the National Association of Home Builders, have adopted ANSI, the vast majority of the plans, whether it be through production builders, high volume production builders, or custom builders, don't necessarily follow ANSI. Most of it pertains to the stairwell, the second floor stairwell. So it's just something that we're going to have to try to adjust and deal with. The adjusting the comparable square footage gives us a little bit of heartburn, because in my mind, we feel like we may have to do that with an extraordinary assumption, but again, that's something that may not be allowed in Fannie Mae appraisals. So how we do that and remain factual and reliable, even though it may not be big numbers on square footage, and in some areas it could. So those are some of the things we're trying to figure out how to work through. Regarding desktop appraisals, I believe all of us recognize for some time that this is something that's coming, and been trying to prepare ourselves. Honestly, in talking to my clients that are mortgage lenders, I'm not sure that they're prepared for a desktop or understand the risks that are associated with it. The risk being in the fact of, one, how do they obtain this information to get it to appraisers? Two, it's still the appraiser's responsibility to verify the information, and I'm not real sure how I do that, to be honest. I know there's some third-party data providers out there that are gearing up. Honestly, I couldn't name one that I could call right now, though. So I'm not sure how I do that. I know it's an option too. We can use MLS photos, but we still have to verify those photos. And at least in the area that I work in, I can't imagine asking a realtor or a homeowner to take the time to go through the house and FaceTime me. I just, maybe that would work. I don't know. I just, knowing my market and the people I deal with, that brings concerns. I do see there's probably some favorable aspects of desktop appraisals. I don't see it being a huge saver of time necessarily. I think that the appraiser is going to spend as much time trying to verify data in a lot of cases as they would necessarily driving. I know in our market anyway, we're fortunate. We're not a rural market, but we're fortunate enough to be able to stack 2 or 3 homes up back to back. So that driving time, although it could be significant, there's some savings there. So the clients that I've talked to, granted, they're probably regional mortgage lenders, that right now they don't see a favorable side to the desktop. A lot of them compare it to what the 2055 was at the time, and that came out hot and kind of went away at some. So a lot to remain to be seen. A lot of things we're still trying to figure out, and that's kind of where we're at.
Would
Okay,
you like to respond to that now, or let the other panelists go first?
well, that's a good question. If you've got an answer to Alan, then maybe it would be a good time to answer that question.
I agree, Jody. Go ahead, Lyle.
Well, so regarding your ANSI question, I mean, obviously I can't speak for the other secondary market institutions as to whether or not they would adopt this in the future. But what I can say is that my understanding of their policy is that ANSI is already acceptable, and there are many appraisers who already follow it. And so if if you're converting from an old method into a new method and it's ANSI, that should be acceptable to pretty much everybody in the secondary market. I don't think there's anybody who prohibits it. Regarding the desktop and the preparation by the lending community, anything new is going to take time. I will raise an analogy that maybe someone on the call won't necessarily love this analogy, but it's real. We announced an appraisal waiver for certain loans back in December of 2016. And we saw it took lenders 2 to 3 years for the whole community to really learn how to use those effectively and to reach high adoption rates. That's okay. This is an option. It's something that's available if they want to use it, but it's not mandatory. Nobody has to use it.
Thank you, Lyle. Jody, you may be on mute.
There you go. I have to put $10 in the hat. I apologize for that. Alan, do you want me to move on to Dawn, or did you have a response?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Okay, next up on our panelist, Dawn Molitor-Gingrich. And Dawn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jody. And thanks again to Lyle. Very much appreciate your time and effort. I will also give a disclaimer that I took a considerable amount of time to talk to a lot of different types of people who are users or involved in doing appraisals, in asking them about the ANSI as well as the desktop to get a broader set of knowledge. And so I've talked to appraisers, I've talked to people who own appraisal companies, people who do a lot of desktop work, lenders, builders, people of assessment. So I've talked to a variety of people. So some of the question I'm going to ask is related to that connection. And I hope it's helpful to you. One of the things I want to personally ask you is I'm concerned about the use of the ANSI standard and the application of it in low to moderate income areas. And the reason I bring that up to you is because for many years that I worked at a large financial institution, we were having problems closing CRA loans, Community Reinvestment Act loans. And part of the problem was the appraiser believing that certain sections of the improvement they couldn't give full value to. And some of it had to do with ceiling height. Some of it had to do with different areas in the home, what had been done. And I had a senior officer from the bank ask me what was going on. And I explained it to them. And they said, well, will the market actually purchase that property as it is without taking away certain areas of the improvement? And I said, yes, the appraisers have consistently told me that the market would buy the property in its entirety. And so the comment was, then let's not do that anymore. Ask the appraiser to work off the market exclusively and explain those factors. And then we kept all of our Community Reinvestment Act loans from that point forward in-house. Some of the concerns I have with ANSI and talking to appraisers that work very extensively in low to moderate income areas in the Bay Area, which is where I'm located in Northern California, they are very concerned that the 7-foot ceiling item and several other factors in the ANSI standard will require them to take that area out of the gross living area, yet that market would purchase it as gross living area and would not take it out. And I feel like, has Fannie or any of the other agencies gone out and done any testing of the standard against that issue in particular, since part of the reason you're doing it is you believe it will improve those types of factors related to values of those in the protected group? To me, it looks like it has a greater potential to lower those values. And on top of the ANSI, other aspect of it has to do with that non-market factor, meaning that you're using a standard that is not typical in, let's say, the market that the appraiser is located in. I don't know any assessors in California. I don't know any realtors. I've interviewed a number of builders. None of them follow it. And so as a result of that, the other side of that question is, using that standard all in itself might actually put them in harm's way with USPAP, which would require them to use a market-driven analysis. They would need to explain, I think, in USPAP that I'm doing this aspect of the ANSI standard as requested by my client, and then potentially have to explain that that is not how the market analyzes the data, and then have to work through what the market does in the analysis of the data and explain the differences in order to be compliant with USPAP. So those are two of the top concerns. I'll be honest, there were many other comments that people made, but I think those two got the most common statement. And then in the desktop, I'm going to go back to Alan's comment, and this will help you in your response as well. In talking to a large number of appraisers and lenders, their comment about desktop appraisals were, if I have a choice of a desktop, a full appraisal, or a waiver, I'm going to take the waiver. But if I have a desktop or full appraisal, I have no interest in the desktop. Why would I do that? I would much prefer to get in a conclusion that's in its entirety from the appraiser if I'm going to pay money for it. And so their clients have consistently told them they're not interested in the desktop and don't expect to get many, if any, of those. So I would go along with Alan's comment that that's what I got back, both from lenders and from appraisers who have talked to their lenders about that factor. So that's the other aspect of the desktop. And then the other side of the desktop, and something that I think is lacking and would be helpful from a USPAP perspective, is some type of extraordinary assumption that would assist the appraiser in meeting the certification requirements that are identifying that the appraiser needs to have a reasonable basis for believing that these third parties or data collectors are actually performing the work competently, and that they have no doubt or reasonable doubt that the work of those individuals is credible, without having any direct connection with them, which I do believe, I have read the national, excuse me, the National Association of Realtors response to the issue of desktop. I do believe that's something they also talk about, is the ability for these parties to communicate or discuss issues with each other, and to be able to have direct contact, to be able to know more about these individuals, to feel comfortable with the work. One appraiser talked to me about a particular situation where they are receiving information from a company that is actually asking for a group of people in a completely different country to do the analysis and conclusion, and they have no idea what training these individuals have, but they're being told accept it because it's acceptable under the Fannie Mae system. So there's a lot of that concern. Why can't appraisers have a clear, extraordinary assumption that would cover these types of issues and know more about the parties that are involved? And those are the questions I have.
I mean, thank you for raising that, because I think it's really important that we talk about these issues. First, regarding the participation of other parties in the desktop appraisal, this desktop appraisal doesn't involve any third parties. So if you've got a third party property data collection process happening, that's really not the desktop that we're talking about here. And I think, you know, we've talked about that before. That's what I call that a hybrid. Other people may have other names for it, but the hybrid appraisal does what you're talking about. We are testing a hybrid in pilot, but this desktop appraisal in the selling guide is not the same thing. The desktop appraisal really doesn't have a third party involved. What we expect, because these are all purchase transactions, is that the appraiser is going to rely pretty heavily on the MLS. And appraisers, you know, we have a lot of other tools. You can Google a property and learn a lot about it, and you can get aerial imagery and street level imagery and public records. So there's data sources out there that you can bring to bear on the problem. But I think the primary data source is probably going to be MLS, and your primary source is probably that list agent or whatever the list agent has done to generate that MLS data. So is the list agent an independent third party? Not at all, right? They have an interest in the transaction. So I think that creates a challenge for the appraiser. How do you validate? But at the same time, it really simplifies the problem. You're not dealing with a whole bunch of other parties. It's you and the list agent. Got to figure it out, right? And the way I think about this is verification or validation is not the same thing as recreation. And we understand this, appraisers understand this, because this is what we do with comparable data all day long, right? Generally speaking, in many cases, we're using comparables that we haven't personally inspected the interior of the property. So we're looking at third-party data sources, and often it's list agent as the primary source. And then we use different ways of getting comfortable with that, or of, some cases challenging it and saying, I'm not comfortable with that. And I think this will work much the same way. I think that from an enforcement perspective now, from Fannie Mae's perspective on how we are going to, where we're going to set the bar and how we're going to enforce this, which I think is a good starting point for you to try and understand what the scope of work requirement is for you, is that you never want to take a list agent entirely at face value, right? They are an interested party. So you do want to consult whatever other sources you have in the normal course of business.
Right.
But if you can look at an image, whether it's from a satellite view, aerial view, or from a street level view, from an independent source like a Google or MapQuest, or there's other companies out there that do this, and you see that it matches the same property that you see in MLS, and then you go to public records and you see a description and it's generally consistent with what you see in MLS, you start to build a case that, hey, yeah, this list agent is probably reliable, at least up to this point. And I think as you look at the MLS photos, then you ask yourself, you're using now your own powers of observation in looking at those pictures. And that's another way that you sort of validate in your own mind and get comfortable with this. We're not trying to make this difficult. It's different, and appraisers need to analyze. And one way you analyze is compare and contrasting different sources and looking at the source that's in front of you and kind of looking at it with a critical eye and deciding if it's meaningful or not. I think we'll all get more comfortable with this over time, but it's going to take some practice, and it's kind of a new way of thinking in some cases. Regarding lenders, I'll give you the same answer I gave Alan, which is it's voluntary. Nobody has to do this. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, could I follow up with just a couple of points? I should have been more specific to say the floor plan is the biggest concern that I hear, that information is coming from, in some cases, parties who are not located in this country, who are being asked to solve the problem, and they hand it back and give it to the appraiser. And they're very reluctant in being willing to take that information. But I do get the same response you just gave from virtually all the appraisers, that I am trained, I can look at Google, I have software that actually can potentially give me an idea of what the square footage is based on that software using Google data. And then I can compare it to MLS, I can compare it to the assessor's data, I can talk to the listing agent, and I can figure out what makes sense. So if the assessor said 2,000 and the data I could collect said 1,500, 500 square feet is too much of a difference. I have to figure out that difference and then explain where I got my data. So I did get really good responses that are very similar to what you said. But the floor plan, using outside sources being given to the appraiser and being told this is your data to use, that has not gone over very well with people.
Well, thank you for the clarification. When it comes to the floor plan, I think it's like so many other sources that appraiser can consume. Is appraiser ultimately owns that, right? You've got to decide whether or not you're going to use it, and the appraiser has the ability to adapt it. So, for example, in an egregious case, I'm not saying this would always apply, but in an egregious case, I could take a floor plan from somebody else and take the parts that I think are accurate and plug them into my software and generate a new floor plan and overlay the other parts that I think are inaccurate. I can fix those to some degree, right? So
Right.
we're not saying you have to use somebody else's floor plan, but now let me say, in defense of some of these floor plan applications, I'll drop a couple of names here. One that I'm familiar with is called Inside Maps, and Inside Maps is using a computer application that you can put on your cell phone.
Right.
And the application itself is not something that anybody can alter. So from my point of view, that's an independent source. The people who wrote that code, people who developed that application, they have no involvement in the transaction. They have no skin in the game. They don't care if it's high or low or in between. Their only goal is accuracy, and that's because they know Fannie Mae is testing their application, and we're looking for accuracy, right? So we've talked with several of these companies. We've talked to them about our desire for them to follow ANSI and how they code their application, and they have committed to us that they are doing that. There have been in the past some pieces where a person needed to make some decisions. They're working hard to code that out to make it just a wholly self-contained application. So from my point of view, if I went to a website of one of these application builders and they explain to me how they do it, and it's consistent algorithmically with ANSI and with good practice, and then I get an unaltered document from them, that's an independent third-party source. Now, I still have to decide whether I'm going to trust it, whether I'm going to use it, but I don't necessarily have to validate it in the same way I would with someone who's a party to the transaction.
Yes, I can see that.
Getting better all the time, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do this now is, quite frankly, I think it's a great opportunity to introduce unbiased technology into the valuation process, but they need to be able to monetize it in order to be sustainable. This will give them some opportunity to monetize, and it could be a win-win for all of us, right? In the long run.
And I definitely give you credit for the modernization process. We've been doing what we've done for a very long time, and there is a lot of really good technology out there. On that technology side, I would say that as long as the appraiser can understand how that technology works, I think they'd be in good shape there. Much like the advisor opinion that's out regarding AVMs, the appraiser is equally responsible, in my mind, to understand how those software programs work, to know their accuracy levels so they can be comfortable with it, just like they would if they were using an AVM. The advisor opinion makes it clear the things the appraiser should be responsible for knowing about, quote, the black box, you might say. So I think that, yes, if you can get that information, and the appraisers have told me they can, then I do see the relevancy or the positive side of that modernization. And it just will take time for people to get used to it.
I mean, many of you have probably heard my little scientific analogy here, but I'm fascinated by planetary geology. Just goes with my own personal interests. And I've observed these Mars rovers with great interest. As a person who was once a geologist, I'd love to be bouncing around on Mars with a rock hammer, right, taking samples, but I can't get there. And so we send these machines, and the machines drill the rock and take the sample, and then they analyze the sample and they send it back to Earth, and they tell us what fraction of silicon and iron and all the different Elemental components. From 50 million miles away, a robot is measuring with great precision the chemical composition of a rock. How come I can't get consistency on the size of a house in my own neighborhood? It's because we're not using the right tools, and we need to do better. This is one of the drivers of the problem, is when we look at appraisals, repeat appraisals of the same house, we see a great deal of inconsistency in how they're described. So some of the challenges that you're talking about in terms of, well, my market does it this way and my market does it that way, and agents do it this way and assessors do it that way. The reality is nobody's doing it in a consistent way, or at least there's way too much inconsistency within markets on the same house by appraisers practicing in the same market with the same constraints. They give us different answers, and that's unacceptable. We need to get to the point where we get one answer for a house. It is one size. And the Mars rover can tell me, so why can't I get a machine to tell me here, right? That's kind of the long-term vision of where we want to get to, is every time we measure a house, we get the exact same answer. There's no doubt about it, because that house is a certain size. So this is maybe the first step or baby step, but we need to get there.
Sure.
It reflects poorly on all of us that when we send two appraisers to appraise the same house, that they come back with widely different answers. That shouldn't happen. And this is one step in trying to help make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, appraisers have told me that the lenders do contribute to that problem, because they will say, well, that isn't permitted. We won't let you give value to it. The appraiser will say, but the market would give value to it. And the lender will respond with, we don't care, we won't let you give value to it. So I know that there is contribution there by the lender dictating certain things to the appraiser that the appraiser doesn't agree with.
Yeah, and appraisers need to stand up to the lender and say, look, this is the market. I'm your market expert. I'll tell you what I know about the market. But appraisers also need to be able to defend those judgments, right? They have to be able to provide the evidence. So I think it is a two-way street. And I'll be the first to admit, lenders can be a part of the problem. And one of the reasons why I'm talking to this group today, and why we do a lot of outreach to the appraiser profession, appraiser community, is because the way that our business model works is that Fannie Mae is in the secondary market. Our customer, our contractual relationship is with the lender. And so we get the appraisal through the filter of the lender. And the concerns you're expressing are a concern. In some cases, things get lost in translation, right? So we want to talk with appraisers and try and, help make clear how we intend to manage risk and what our policies are. But anyway, I did want to get back to that point about value, right? The ANSI standard is about description. It's not about value. It's not about adjustment. So if ANSI says you have to describe it in a certain way, which may mean lower ceiling heights get taken out of the GLA and captured somewhere else, it doesn't change your value. You can still adjust that something else area at the same rate as GLA if that's how your market treats it, right? It's okay this shouldn't change your value unless you simply didn't have the right square footage in the first place, which this is intended to make sure we have accurate and consistent description. But value adjustment is a whole nother question, right?
I think that that's very helpful what you just said, because many appraisers believed, especially in those more low to moderate income areas, that they were going to have to just literally dismiss those areas that don't meet ANSI and not include them in any way, shape, or form in their valuation, yet the market would have totally recognized them. So I really appreciate those comments.
Really important theme, right, is that this shouldn't impact value unless there was an error in the square footage in the first place. But if there are areas that the market gives value to, you give value to them, right? You adjust according to market reaction. That's always going to be the principle.
That's very helpful. Thank you for explaining that.
All right. Awesome Q&A, Dawn, Lyle, and we'll move on to our next panelist, and that will be Mark Barrett. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for the Appraisal Institute for putting this on. Lyle, thank you for being here. I've got the unenviable position of following Lyle's presentation and Don and Alan taking all the bright thoughts in response away already. So I'll try my best to ask a few questions. And Lyle, if it's okay with you, I'll start on the desktop thing since we've been talking about that here and just ask a few questions. It was notable to me hearing your perspective that the floor plan is not considered a third-party source. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that because it is a systematic process of collecting data that you don't consider it a third-party source. Am I understanding that correctly?
Let me clarify. I don't consider it to be an interested party source.
Okay.
It's definitely a third party source, but it's not an interested party.
Okay, I misunderstood. Okay, and as you look at the applications that are collecting or assembling these floor plans, do you see no ability to manipulate? Given I think you were talking about, you kind of go out there, you run the application, and it gives a number, and that number is going to be consistent, over and over, or there's one right answer, kind of. Do you see any ability to manipulate?
There are great controls within the software itself that will highlight if areas get missed. But if you miss an area, what happens is your square footage is smaller, so then your value is lower. So everybody's on guard against that because nobody in the lending process wants a low value. On the other hand, there's really no way to expand it. Like you can't take a picture of something that's not there. Mm-hmm. And these things have kind of an internal triangulation system. You start from a certain point and then you build out from there. Within the algorithm, all of the movement of the device is captured. So you can't just exit the building and go somewhere else, right? They geocode the starting point. So I won't say it's entirely impossible to corrupt it, but the companies that do this are very much aware of that concern and have tried very hard to build controls within the algorithm itself that using date and time stamps and again geometry to help ensure that they're capturing a true representation of the house.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. It seems like I've run one or two, and my amateur beta testing self forgot to record my garage, so it just didn't show up on the sketch. And I know an appraiser would catch that, but I've certainly seen it.
Leave stuff out, but it's hard to add two garages when you only have one.
Sure. It seems like there are multiple applications that assemble these floor plans. Is that
yes?
Do they, from one to the other, do they produce kind of a single answer from your perspective, or is there variation between the applications?
Well, we've done some testing where they produce some very similar results, but in cases where they didn't, that's a great feedback loop for them. And I think they're always working to get better. It's a great takeaway. We haven't revealed our own internal testing at this point, and some of it's a little bit outdated. We did some last year that they continue to iterate on their process since then. So there may be something that we'd like to speak more about in the future. But I've heard a number of anecdotes of people appraisers who say, okay, I took this app and that app and I put them both in the hands of like two of my trainees and I sent them out there and they came back with numbers that were like within 10 square feet, right? It's anecdotal, but there are some suggestions that it's pretty consistent. At least that's it. It's at least as consistent as what you might get when you send two appraisers to use a tape measure. So that's comforting to us.
When these floor plans, it is not a requirement that these floor plans indicate a GLA, just that they're showing the kind of flow of the property and the layouts, or do they come with the
It is a requirement that the exhibit in the appraisal show the exterior dimensions and the calculations.
Okay. Great.
Now, if you had the exterior dimensions, you could create your own calculations. But I believe the app providers, at least the ones that we've worked with, do provide, or they're capable of outputting both dimensions and calculations. They're also capable in some cases of producing different kinds of exhibits for different purposes. So for example, they could produce an exhibit for marketing purposes that doesn't have the calculations or the dimensions. And that would not be adequate for the appraiser's needs.
That makes sense. Thank you. In like a normal desktop process, when a desktop is acceptable, meeting the criteria you laid out, and it is selected, do you imagine that a floor plan is already in hand in like the loan application or the through the listing, or is this obtained once the desktop is decided upon?
So our policy is not prescriptive on that point. I think we're kind of going to watch and see how the industry adapts to the opportunity. I think either of those paths, or even maybe some alternatives to those, are possible. Mm-hmm. Now, if I were a real estate agent and I wanted to, be able to leverage a desktop appraisal to help my transaction go faster or easier or whatever, then I would prepare for that by making sure I put into the MLS everything that I thought the appraiser would need. So that is something that as a real estate agent I could communicate to the buyer, who could communicate it to the lender, who would then have some level of certainty up front, right? So that's a possible pathway, but it's not the only one. It's also possible for if you're getting work through an AMC or even through a lender, they may establish a relationship with one of these third-party companies to obtain the floor plan, and so then it may happen after the order is placed. So I think there's lots of flexibility around how this gets done, and time will tell kind of what rises to the top, what turns out to be the most efficient process.
Thank you. I was noticing the first bullet point on the benefits of this on the handout you guys have issued that supports digital transformation in the mortgage origination process, and I was wondering the thought behind that statement, and I'm hearing you talk about the floor plan. I'm wondering if that is the kind of single answer, or as close to a single answer as there is. Is that the thought behind that statement?
That's an important aspect of it. Yes, for sure. Okay. We think that technology holds great promise to help eliminate some of the inconsistency and human error in the generation of GLA, and we'd love to see that advance, see if that can really work. But I think there's other potential opportunities for digital transformation as well. How you're getting information about a whole bunch of other things. When you're looking at pictures, is a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional world? And is that a true projection? That's a great question. If you're talking about things that are externalities, view and location and locational influences, how do we sort of get consistency in those spaces? We rely heavily on the appraiser's judgment right now. I can tell you that's a challenge, right? We have in the Uniform Appraisal Data Set, the UAD, a requirement for appraisers to report water view. And I can tell you that if we look at any set of comps that have potential water views, if those comps are used by, let's say, 10 different appraisers, a third of them will come back and say it's waterfront, and a third of them will come back and say it's water view, and a third of them will come back and say nothing. And there's just tremendous inconsistency in how appraisers report externalities. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not affecting their value. They may be, thinking about it in their own head and making, accommodations for it in the value. But it's hard for us to follow their logic sometimes because the descriptions are so inconsistent. And so this is going to, anything that we do around scope of work that involves appraiser consulting other sources besides their own personal experience is moving towards a more reproducible and data-centric world.
Okay. Thank you. I kind of echo. I don't know if confusion in the marketplace is the right way for me to describe it, but certainly a lot of clients that are calling me saying, "Hey, you know a little better than I do what's going on. I'm not prepared for this when it's coming." I kind of wanted to either maybe emphasize, I think, or restate something that you said and make sure I'm hearing it right. It really sounds like this is a rollout of an option that can be a very, very slow ramp as people watch how it works and then jump on should they want to do that later from a lender or appraiser perspective entirely.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'd love it if it, was widely applauded and broadly accepted, and we got great market penetration. But it's not mandatory. It is voluntary, and we'll see how it goes, and we'll try and learn from the experience.
Wonderful. In one of the handouts or slides I had seen that this obviously comes through rigorous testing of, and was this an extension of the COVID desktop process? Is that kind of where the genesis of the concept came?
Yes, for sure. Yes, this is directly related to our COVID experience. So just for most people probably in this audience are already familiar with the process, but basically the announcement that the United States was suffering from a pandemic happened about March 13th, and FHFA came to the GSEs on about the midnight on March 13th and said, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What if appraisers can't go into homes? The whole mortgage market could shut down." And over the next 10 days, we put together a solution which included desktop appraisals and also exterior only appraisals for an emergency purpose, right? That flexibility was allowed until May 31st of the following year. And so we had about 15 months of actual production data on desktop appraisals and on exterior only appraisals. And so we were able to look at the production and see, what it looked like. We did a lot of QC work. We did a lot of testing. And that helped to inform the current decision, the current rollout.
I wonder if there was any observations you could share on appraisals or appraisers' methodologies coming in during that time, mistakes we might have been making, creating liability or missing on value, those sorts of things. I mean, I assume the floor plan and functional obsolescence was a response because we didn't have that data during the COVID desktop.
It's actually kind of the inverse. What we found is even though we didn't require sketches, appraisers provided sketches about 1/3 of the time voluntarily. And so that was interesting and actually kind of impressive. And kudos to appraisers for, trying to go the extra mile in that regard. The top defects that we cited were, getting back to, I think, Dawn's question, appraisers relying on extraordinary assumptions when we really wanted them to be certain around the description and not to rely on guesswork. In many cases, they were able to cure those defects. They actually did have certainty. They just didn't realize it or didn't express it in the report. And so when we would go back to them and say, "Well, how did you get this information? Well, why didn't you write that down?" And it solved a lot of problems when appraisers are transparent about, or disclosure. The old saying, disclose is doubly true for desktops. describe your thought process, describe your data sources, figure out, make sure that your client can read the report and understand what choices you made and how you ended up where you ended up. That's much better than just saying, well, I didn't know, and so I assumed.
It seems like, maybe obvious, but it seems like a fully developed work file on where these sources for condition and layout of room are especially important on these type of assignments. The last question on the desktops, prevalence. I saw the criteria. Do you, I've seen number thrown around 15% maybe of purchases that this might be eligible for. Do you have, what would be the prevalence of this option now if you had to guess? And is Fannie Mae hoping that this expands to 50%, 30%? I think a lot of appraisers I've talked to are wondering where this goes.
Well, just based on the eligibility box, so the single family residential, primary owner occupant, and less than 90% LTV, just those three criteria alone, purchase transaction, that is roughly in the ballpark of half of purchase transactions fall in that category. Now, we do a lot of business, or we have the last several years in particular, a lot of refinance business as well. And there's some purchase activity in other spaces that isn't, single family residential and all that jazz. So all of that stuff would be excluded at this point. Where we think there might be opportunity to expand would be, maybe take a look at some other property types. Would this make sense for condo? In some ways, it makes more sense for condos. Condos are very repeatable units, and in a purchase situation where you kind of have the market discipline around that, and you have very similar kinds of comparables, then a desktop might make a lot of sense. Might be a really streamlined way to approach a purchase transaction on a condo. So that's one thing we're looking at. I think there's a mission aspect to this. Fannie Mae has a mission, and one reason that we are focusing on primary owner occupancy is because of our mission. And so we'll continue to look at ways that we can try and support the mission and provide benefits to first-time home buyers. Right now, the LTV cap is really impacting them. But at the same time, I think the LTV cap is a good risk buffer for Fannie Mae, because we're concerned about property condition and whether or not anything is being missed in the process. And this gives us a little LTV wiggle room on that question.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate you answering those questions. I think a quick statement on ANSI and one question. We at my firm, we were thinking about expanding nationally, teaching trainees and new people in business, and we sort of made the decision 2.5 years ago that we needed to follow a standard for consistency of output and teaching and all of that.
ANSI.
What's that?
I hope you chose ANSI.
We did.
Okay. Otherwise, there'd be a lot of backpedaling, right?
My luck, we would choose the wrong one, but no, we did, and it's been really good. And I think most appraisers go through the process of measuring a subject property and comparing the resulting GLA according to whatever the data source is of that market. And we have a habit within our reports of reconciling, pointing out what we measured it at, and also what the county or MLS or whatever the reasonable source is, builder, and then reconciling those differences. And in tens of thousands of appraisals, we see that in most cases, maybe 85%, that the comparable, that kind of proves to us that the comparables GLAs are usable and not needing to be adjusted according to ANSI one way or another. And so I just kind of wanted to share that in our own practice, where it just sort of, for us, we just are kind of naturally doing this anyway. And I think a lot of appraisers probably are too.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. So your experience is great to hear. I would rather that appraisers hear this from each other than from Fannie Mae. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm going to ask Bill if he can circulate those resources, because there's, like I say, there's these 3 different articles out there which you can pull up on the internet that appraisers talking about their experience with ANSI, independent of Fannie Mae. I mean, these, you know, were based on their experience prior to our new policy, and it's really interesting to see and to hear, and I think it provides good perspective. It's better if you guys hear it from someone else than from me in a lot of ways, right?
One of the things that I've noticed that's kind of a nuance, but what it provides for me is a structure to the exception process, because even though we're doing what we're doing, of course, there are geographic nuances, as both Alan and Don have spoke about, where we ought to be doing something different, or the market standard is something that is outside of what ANSI is describing. I am wondering kind of when to, I'm not sure you can answer this specifically, but that there's this exception process, and when to use an exception, or to handle things like if a berm home is 0 square feet, that seems like a pretty good reason to use an exception.
I agree.
In let's say a raised ranch in Ohio is an example where, you know, the bottom level would be considered basement, but the market considers it gross living area. Do I make that let's say it's a 2,000 square foot house? Do I make that a 1,000 square foot in the GLA, leaving the comps the way they are, because I don't know how I can't tell how they were measured specifically, just in this hypothetical, and then making the below grade adjustment down below? Are you following my specific example there? I'm just wondering for some insight or guidance on when and how to use the exception.
Well, in that situation, and it's not just Ohio, but there's other jurisdictions where it's common to include the basement in the total GLA. ANSI prohibits that, and Fannie Mae would prohibit it. Our adoption would require you to put those spaces in the basement. So that does present the challenge of, you know, how do you know whether or not the subject or the comp area is in the basement or not? I think there's no pass here, right? You actually need to know that in order to give value. Because if you're using a house that actually has 2,000 square feet above grade to compare to one that only has 1,000 square feet above grade, you're not getting an accurate value there, right? So appraiser, if they are not already doing it, they need to be taking that extra step of understanding that division between above and below grade. And growing up, again, in the Midwest, where everybody's got a basement, my experience is people differentiate. It matters to value. It matters to the marketplace. So appraisers need to gain that information. Now, if you can't get that information for a comp, I'd discard that comp. I'd go find a different comp.
Okay. If there are, last question, if there are, let's just say bracketing, if this creates issues with bracketing in a sales grid, and I wonder how
it doesn't require bracketing.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering how bracketing may be the wrong terminology to use there, but I'm wondering how collateral underwriter might respond to some of these submissions that you might create larger differences than is typically seen. Any thought on that?
Generally speaking, when appraisers tell the truth, collateral underwriter will reward that behavior.
Fair enough. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That was great Q&A, Lyle. You as well. So we got a couple minutes left, and we'll get to some of the questions that haven't been answered so far. So Lyle, this one's for you. Did Fannie Mae collaborate with FHLMC, VA, HUD, et cetera, with regards to adopting ANSI so that they're all on the same page? And appraisers don't know if an appraisal is being sold to Fannie Mae. So how do you know?
Well, Jody, the truth is, because we are a business, we cannot consult with those other secondary market entities on our policy development because that would be an antitrust violation. So no, we did not consult with them. Now, there are cases where we do work together, but we only do that when under kind of exceptional circumstances, and it would be under the direct supervision of our conservator, FHFA, and they will tell us when we need to do that. But in this case, they did not instruct us, and so we had to work independently.
Okay.
I will say that, again, my understanding is that many appraisers already voluntarily use ANSI, and that it is consistent with the expectations of the other secondary market entities. Having no standard at all means you'll accept just about any standard, right? So I think you're going to be okay there. If you follow ANSI, you shouldn't get into any trouble with the other entities, but I'll be interested to hear if there are problems.
Okay, great. Another question for you. The National Association of Realtors sent a letter to delay the adoption of ANSI standard. What is Fannie Mae's response, if there is one?
We have a group at Fannie Mae that their role is to interface with government entities and also lobbies, and they are working on that. They have consulted with us, so we expect to have an answer for NAR soon, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment until that's actually done.
Okay, great.
That said, a lot of their questions were similar to what we've talked about today, and my answers would be similar to what I shared today. I think that's a fair thing to say.
Great, thanks. Another question. Let's see. The National Association of Home Builders adopted the ANSI standard. Are their members required to use them, or is it voluntary when describing their properties?
Yeah, I'd refer you to the NAHB for that one.
Okay.
Not my hat.
Jody, let me jump in real quick while you're taking a look at the questions box. So we have addressed a lot of the questions in the SRA panel, and in the dialogue over the last hour, I am going to forward all of these questions to Lyle's team. You're not going to be able to get through these or all of them, but I would hope that they might illuminate future communications and FAQs that might be forthcoming, just to give you a sense as to where some of the participants' minds were today. And we will be very happy to drive out additional resources to the attendees today, so that including the slide deck and any of the articles, and we can touch base after the call about how to best communicate and disseminate that to the participants, which we'll work together to resolve and make sure that happens.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
We're going to publish FAQs, and so we're still at a stage where we can edit and evolve those FAQs. So this would be great partnership in helping us to address common questions.
Perfect. So I think we have time for one more question, Bill.
And I've got one more too after you, Jody.
Okay, why don't you go first?
Well, I had a question here regarding the use of your database, Fannie Mae's database. Is it possible for Fannie Mae to provide a floor plan or sketch from a pre-existing appraisal to a lender to provide to the appraiser? The comment is, this may be a good starting point if the prior appraisal is just a few years old and there have been no changes to the dwelling, such as additions, interior layout changes, and the like. Is that something that might be possible in the future, Lyle?
Right now, the way a floor plan is captured in the UAD is just as an image, and it's not tagged in any way with metadata. So the machine can't identify the floor plan. You actually have to have people look at the report in order to find the floor plan. So right now, the ability to push out a floor plan is not technologically feasible. With the new UAD, we think that will change. And that's coming in 2024 roughly. And so at that point, we might have the technological capability. But there's a whole nother question, which is, there's two other questions. One is, do we have the legal rights to share that? Because if that's generated by a specific appraiser, we have to look at that. And then the other question is, do we have a pathway? How would you share that? So we haven't even unpacked those other two questions yet because it's a moot point. We can't identify the floor plan in the first place. So how are we going to share it, right? So, but I think as time goes on, if we get that technological capability, then yeah, we'd probably look at that in greater detail and see what's possible.
Thanks, Lyle.
Okay, one last question. I see a bit of concern with a lot of questions about the use of AMCs and lack of direction, lack of just competent staff, on and on again. What's your thoughts on the use of AMCs ordering desktops?
When we've looked at appraisal quality for appraisals that came through the AMC model versus appraisals that came through a lender direct model, we haven't seen anything that would cause us concern about using AMCs for desktops.
Okay. Bill, I think we're at the end of our time, right?
Yeah, we are, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time and for all of our panelists and participants. And like we said, we're going to be pushing out some additional resources following the call. Lyle, continue our conversations and collaboration here. I really appreciate everybody's participation today. And we look forward to continue to work with you on these and other issues. So with that, this is going to conclude today's briefing on desktops and ANSI square footage calculation. Thank you to everybody, all of the participants and panelists for your participation, and we hope that you've enjoyed the discussion. We hope you have a great day.